If you think ColecoVision plays all Atari cartridges,
You mean it can't?
here's Pac-Man on ColecoVision. But here's Pac-Man for the Atari 5200 Super System.
Now you're talking.
And it doesn't work on ColecoVision.
But won't their adapter?
It won't play Super System cartridges.
Not pole position?
Not this pole position.
Not centipede?
Not this centipede. Only on the Atari 5200 Super System.
But aren't they hard to find?
They're everywhere.
Everywhere?
The Atari 5200 Super System.
Happy birthday to the Atari 5200 Super System. It's big, beyond big, it's bulky. It is one of the biggest consoles ever made. In fact, it still holds that title. The FM Town Smarty doesn't count, as one of its models is basically a PC tower. Look at it. Some say that it was the beginning of the end for that era in terms of what we saw as gaming. It was also the last console released for that generation, leading into the video game crash of 1983. Did you know that in Japan they refer to the crash of '83 as the Atari shock? Weird, right? The exact date of its release is not well known. In fact, I could not find any information indicating a specific day. All we know is that it was released sometime in November of 1982. And at this point, I'm just happy I even have the year.
Arcade players, get ready. The new Atari 5200 Super System is here. With a controller so advanced it plays arcade. Graphics so real it looks arcade. With arcade hits you can't play on any other system. No other home video system can touch it. The new Atari 5200 Super System. It's as good as you are, maybe even better. Next time.
This titanic size of a system was a successor to the already aging and very well selling 2600. By the time the 5200 was released, the VCS had sold close to 9 million units. But here's the thing, the console was late by about 2 years. Yup, you heard that right. You see, the original developers of the 2600 had wanted the 5200 to be released close to 1980. But with the rise of the computer market, the bigwigs at Atari wanted to repackage the 5200 hardware under a computer case, tweak the tech a bit, and then sell it under the 8-bit computer lineup. To prevent developers from jumping ship to the 5200 if released at the same time as the computer lineup, Atari shelved the console as they tried to break into the computer market, thereby forcing developers to commit to the 8-bit computer lineup. Now think about this for a minute. The 5200 could have been out around the same time or slightly before the Intellivision. Had they incorporated backwards compatibility from the start, that would have placed them in a good spot. The 2600 had yet to start selling through the roof, meaning consumers would not have had an excuse to walk past the new system. Combine that with the idea that Space Invaders could have been released on the 5200 versus the 2600, and you start to really wonder what could have been. The 5200 could be the one selling 30 million units instead of the VCS, and we could have had a decent port of Pac-Man, but then again, we wouldn't have this port and all the fun that goes along with it. But aside from all that, what made this thing tick? The Super System, as it was advertised, had an MOS 6502C CPU clocking in at 1.75 MHz. In comparison, the Atari 2600 had an MOS 6507 running at 1.19 MHz. Memory was a big difference, with the 5200 coming in with 16 kilobytes of RAM versus just 128 bytes on the VCS. Nowadays, we all know what more RAM could do, and the folks at Atari knew that well back in the day. It had two graphic chips, the Antique, which was an abbreviation for Alphanumeric Television Interface Controller, and the GTIA chip, which stood for Graphics Television Interface Adapter. Both of these chips could also be found in the Atari 400 and 800 computers. Now, here is the chip and the layout for the GTI. I will explain and go over in excruciating detail all 41 pinouts on this chip. Here we go. Yeah, right. It boasts a screen resolution of up to 384 by 240. Colors on screen could go up from 2 to 16 with 80 to 320 pixels per line depending on the amount of colors used. Programmers could use the antique chip to bring up that number to 256 colors to be displayed, with up to 16 per scan line. When it comes to sprites, the system could display 4 8-pixel wide sprites, 4 2-pixel wide sprites, and each could be 128 or 256 pixels in height with 1 color per sprite. It had 3 VLSI chips. 3. I have no idea how that helps the system, but it had 3. Sound capabilities consisted of 4 channels PSG sound on the Pokey sound chip, with PSG being short for Programmable Sound Generator. By comparison, the 2600 only had 2 channels. Listen to that sound.
You're out.
Next up, the controllers. Atari thought that by going from 1 button to 19 overall buttons and implementing an analog joystick that used rubber padding rather than springs and helping it to recenter, it would somehow enhance the gameplay experience and allow for more gaming options. None of those assumptions were correct. This controller was crap. When Atari designed the controller, they created one of the worst, if not the worst, joystick in the history of gaming consoles. But it did introduce the pause button to the gaming lexicon. The trackball controller was another oversized gargantuan of an object. The 5200 and this controller alone probably took up most of the space in your room. It worked great with games such as Super Breakout, but in the end, very few titles took advantage of this controller. They did have the plan to release a smaller version of the 5200 dubbed the 5100 or 5200 Junior, but due to its failure to make any sort of impact in the market and that little thing called the crash of '83, that smaller unit was never released. I'm surprised at this point that they didn't release it later in the '80s, just for the hell of it. But aside from all that boring spec stuff and the size of it and all the console redesigns of it, let's get down to what's really important, the games. And as little kids, we only cared about the games. Now I'm going to go over the launch titles and those released in 1982, as well as some random titles that came out throughout its short lifespan. Surprisingly, even though the system was discontinued in '84, the last 5200 game was released in 1986. So how good were they? Here we go. Centipede here is an arcade port, and if you think I am bad at this game, you are right. But the reason my character is flying all over the place is the controls. I just so much as move this joystick to one side and my character just flies towards that direction. I can't control it. Other than that, it's a pretty decent port of the arcade hit. I actually had fun with this one. It reminds me of Atari Warriors on the NES, in a way. But it all takes place in a tank, and you don't have soldiers, you just have stationary turrets. The terrain hampers the mobility of the tank, and you have to pivot your turret in the proper direction that you want to shoot. So there's a little bit of strategy as you scroll your way up the level. Defender is a good port of the arcade as well. Again, I had issues controlling the ship since the input on it is very fast as you move from side to side. If you like the arcade, this one is a good title for the 5200 library. Galaxian is another arcade port. This one was never a favorite of mine, even though it is a good upgrade from Space Invaders. You shoot the aliens, clear them out, and you go to the next stage, which is the same thing. Yet for some reason I would have preferred Galaga, but that's just me. Missile Command is just that. Not much to say other than if you've played the 2600 version, you've played Missile Command. I like the end screen though. Now here we have a definitive version of Pac-Man. After that train wreck that was ported to the 2600 just 8 months before, this one actually has a more accurate look of the arcade. Not pixel perfect, but the sounds, the music, and overall gameplay are light years above that thing. Now, why wasn't this packed in with the unit is beyond me. Oh look, it's kicks and it's on the 5200. Yay. Now here's the game that set the arcades on fire just a few years earlier. Now it was on the 5200 with great animation and fully intact gameplay. The pounding sound getting louder as the aliens increase their speed is still panic-inducing. While the gameplay remains somewhat boring after a few minutes, the graphics and the pacing do make it fun in short spurts. This one here is actually a huge improvement over the arcade hit. Oh, this title gets a little bit complicated. I would have to dedicate an entire video on this title alone to get into all the little details, but Star Raiders is a very interesting title with lots of features. The easiest way to give you an idea of what this game is like, it's like playing the game Star Voyager on the NES. If you haven't played Star Voyager, then I envy you. Last of the games released in '82 is Super Breakout. This game was the pack-in title that came with the 5200. Now, Breakout is a fun title, don't get me wrong, and if you had the trackball controller, it was better. I can't control the paddle here as it moves at an insane speed. I just lightly press to one side and the paddle just flies across the screen. I'm sure this was a fun title to play back in the day, but as a pack-in game, I felt it lacked the impact that a Pac-Man or even a Galaxian would have provided. Now here are a few more titles. So when looking back on it, I feel this console could have made a bigger splash had it been released back in 1980 versus 1982. It isn't a bad system, as some make it out to be on the internet. It's a good follow-up to the 2600, but it was released way too late in the market. You have to remember that it was released after the ColecoVision, which hit the market in July of that very same year. The ColecoVision was cheaper, and it even had the Gemini adapter, giving you the ability to play 2600 games on it. The 5200 eventually did get a 2600 adapter that went on top where the games were inserted, but the drawback was that if you had one of the early 5200 models that came with the 4 controller ports, it would not work. The adapter only worked on the following models that only had 2 controller ports. Some reports online state that some very few 4-port models did allow for the adapter to work, but they were rare. Another drawback was the pack-in game, Super Breakout. Again, don't get me wrong, Breakout is a great game and it's fun, but to pack that game in when you have a much better version of Pac-Man to show off is just mind-boggling. Also, the ColecoVision had Donkey Kong as a pack-in. If Atari was looking to reel players in with Breakout as their ace card, they were wrong. The controllers were also a problem from the very beginning and was something that would plague the system throughout its lifetime and way beyond. They are still considered by many to be the worst controllers ever made for a game console. At that point, you can have all the best games in the world, but if you can't play them due to controller issues, then what's the point? So those of you that are watching must be wondering, wow, this guy really hates the system. I don't. I actually recall playing Pac-Man and other titles in my friend's house and having a great time with the 5200 when the damn joysticks worked properly. The graphics still held up and were a huge improvement over the 2600, but in hindsight, this system would have fared better being released in 1980 the way it was intended. The way I see it, too many cooks in the kitchen. That's the best way I can describe Atari management in those times. The 5200 and the 7800 would suffer due to inconsistent goals never set by the company and pivoting towards other markets to try and capture sales. Before I end the video, I want to give a quick shout out to the Sega CD. It was released in October of 1992 here in the States, and it turns 30 years old, but I did not have time to do a video for it since I was doing the Halloween marathon. But I haven't forgotten about the Sega CD. If you guys want to check out what I consider to be one of the best Sega CD reviewing videos on YouTube, go to GameSack. You won't regret it. Hope you enjoyed this quick look back into a system that hits its 40-year mark this month. Ever own one? Or maybe you have great memories of just playing games on it at a friend's house like I did. Share your thoughts in the comments section and be back in a few days when I plan to talk about a forgotten gem of the gaming world. Keep watching, keep playing, and as always, take care of yourselves.